Mark Luba, Vice President of Product Management with IMS Global, and your moderator for today's webinar. At IMS, we believe in the power of dynamic collaboration as a catalyst for digital transformation in education. And in that spirit, this webinar series brings together leaders in our community representing the top learning institutions and EdTech suppliers to share knowledge and ideas for reimagining the educational experience and to explore new opportunities for shaping the future of teaching and learning. Today's webinar topic is test integrity and proctoring, an extremely important and timely subject when institutions are in some cases scrambling to expand their remote learning options while still ensuring program quality. We're joined today for the next 30 minutes or so by two leaders from the software provider Examity, an IMS contributing member. Let me introduce Shailu Tipparaju, the Chief Information Officer, and Scott Foote, the Chief Information Security Officer for Examity. Shailu, I'd like to start the discussion with you today, if it's okay.
Thank you, Mark. Pleasure to be here. Let's go in.
Tell us how proctoring is done with Examity. Can you give us an overview?
I think the best way to think about Examity as an organic fiber of the learning ecosystem of the customer, it becomes a three-step process in how you think about Examity as an online proctoring provider. At a high level, the first step is the integration. For a customer who wants to onboard into online proctoring, they integrate with the Examity system in a secure way that sets up the candidates who have to take the test, the providers who have to set up the test criteria on how they want it proctored. That is a step one of integration. It also brings in a secure role-based single sign-on access for users where data transmission is already underpinned with the LTI that is part of interoperability delivered through the IMS spec. The second part of it, once a test is set up and the proctoring parameters are defined by the provider, the test taker experience comes next. They launch in, they take a test within the customer's platform or assessment system, but proctored by Examity. This happens in both modalities, an automated identity verification and proctoring, a live identity verification and proctoring. And the third step is once a test taker's experience is done, we send the analytics to the customer that gives the proctoring behaviors, the test taker's behaviors, the test results itself are stored in the customer platform. Kind of brings together the contribution of Examity is we have brought the right test taker onto the test taking experience. We have measured the right parameters for a fair test, and we have provided the security on the test content. That's why I would see the proctoring delivery as an overview platform. Scott, anything to add on the security layer about that, on how we encompass the delivery?
Well, one of the fundamental aspects of the interaction with the candidate or the student is the authentication of the student. So this is the online proctoring experience is all about validating that exam, validating the assessment of the test taker and whatever competencies are being measured. So we start every engagement with a couple of steps. We'll get into it a little bit later on into more depth, but we have a couple of steps to perform that authentication with that candidate. We want to do it in such a way not to invade their privacy and not to make them uncomfortable, but to make it absolutely certain this is in fact the test taker that is intended to be assessed. Once we get past that, it's fairly non-intrusive in terms of the experience for the candidate. The proctor gets out of the picture, the candidate takes their exam, the proctor remains available in the background if they need any support, but the purpose of the proctor beyond going through the authentication step is pretty much passed on to simply monitoring to make sure there isn't any cheating behavior. And all of this we try to do, as I said, as least intrusively as possible so the student can focus on the exam and the assessment in front of them.
Thank you. Thank you both, Shailu and Scott. You know, proctoring has been a mainstay of high stakes testing in the brick and mortar world for many years, especially for post-secondary programs. What markets do you serve at Examity, and what are the unique needs of each of those markets?
I think the best way to think about is the dimension of consumers and customers who have evolved in the online proctoring. Higher ed has been an adopter of online proctoring for few years, so they have a little more maturity and adoption in there. The recent trend we have seen has been a significant adoption in the corporate enterprise space. Online learning has evolved in that space, relating to online proctoring as a natural progression for them, and K to 12 has seen adoption. What we have seen as Examity, having done millions of these exams over the years, we have a fairly decent spread across the three, but the higher focus has been higher ed in the past few years. And in the current time, obviously, there's been a rapid adoption on the corporate enterprise side, and the K to 12 has seen a significant adoption. All of them are looking for the common framework, regardless of which domain they're coming from. Can I have user convenience? Can I have test security and integrity? And can I have analytics that give me the framework and the protocols of standard proctoring? I think that is the core need of all of these. And the adoption has significantly seen that ramp up in the last 2 quarters. I would almost say the last 2 quarters have seen the same adoption as the last 2 years, given the nature of what transition has happened in the industry. Mark.
You know, you sort of were leaning into this. I'm sure the pandemic, has driven lots of demand. What were the usage and growth trends before 2020 as compared to now?
The growth, I think, staggering would be a simple way to put it in terms of how fast. Some were towing the waters and considering should we or not. They were left with no choice. So they were left with no choice but to onboard. Some had begun adopting. They were kind of lucky in one sense because they already had tested the parameters. They were familiar with the process. The consumers had tasted the effects and positive outcomes of online proctoring, so they were able to scale up. The way I would think about it, and Scott, I'd welcome you to add more, is those who were investigating got pushed into it and they had to take our support in onboarding. Those who were onboarded scaled up dramatically and very fast. And those who never considered as an option, this opened up because businesses had been disrupted. In our world, we call it creative destruction. On one end, they lost the option to deliver a test. On the other end, this opened up an opportunity that they never considered before. The concerns about privacy and security is where Scott can add a layer and say, how have we provided the transparency and the communication and the visibility of, you could do this, it works, it is secure. Education was a big part of our delivery mechanism before onboarding a customer and helping them scale. Scott, over to you.
No, I agree, Shaylee, with the three large categories of consumers in terms of where they were prior to COVID. We had the full-scale adopters. We had the folks that were experimenting, that were moving online but taking it slowly, and then the folks that were standing on the sidelines watching, wondering whether or not they needed to add this into their curriculum and their program. I would say prior to those three groups, prior to the COVID meteor strike, the more laggards were the folks that were more of the traditional certifications, industry certifications, for example, in my space, privacy and security. There was a significant uptick in terms of folks using proctored exams to go through certification processes to validate competencies, to validate professional competencies. That's been on the rise in my career over the last 30 or so years. I've seen significant uptick in terms of different organizations requiring professional certifications over and above their resume, right, over and above their original 4 or 6 year degrees to demonstrate professional competencies. That, though, was in the offline space. Almost exclusively, those types of certifications were being done in brick and mortar types of facilities. We've seen an explosion in terms of adoption on that side. As I've been studying the market and looking at the different commercial entities that have picked up, moving through COVID, they went from kind of standing on the sidelines looking at online proctoring and wondering whether or not it was viable to wholesale adoption. So it's been quite an enormous uptick there, where I would say in higher ed, Shaylee, maybe I'm wrong, but in higher ed, there were far more consumers in the space, either fully adopted or on their way to adoption, and that accelerated. So the two growth curves, one is significantly more dramatic than the other, but both have been ramping. Even prior to COVID, both were ramping in a very interesting way to demonstrate this whole concept of integrity behind an examination process.
This is a related question, actually. If you can generalize, in what testing situations do your customers tend to elect to use proctoring?
No, that's a terrific way of thinking the framework of online proctoring itself. Not all tests are made equal. Not all formats of tests are delivered equal, but when a test is delivered online, be it a midterm exam for a professor in a higher ed or a certification exam for a high stakes, the way to think about the severity of the test complexity all the way to the high stakes or low stakes test is one dimension of it. The second is the consumer convenience and on demand. So one of the ways they've thought about as our consumers and customers is it offering more delivery mechanisms, hybrid? So do I give the consumer a choice? Do you want to take it in location a center, or do you want to go online? Obviously, in the last few quarters, online was the only choice, but now it has opened up two layers of flexibility from a consumer's perspective. Second, the online has given them an option of on demand 24/7 at any time of their convenience within an environment of their familiarity, because that directly contributes to better performance in our metrics. Third, in terms of what are we giving for the test providers, they were always adjusting their test to match the test providing scenario. And now they have a large flexibility to choose from an automated delivery of test, a live delivery of test, or a hybrid delivery of test, and not have to readjust their exam. And third, I think, is test security. They have found that the one-to-one nature of how the test is delivered in online proctoring increases user satisfaction, user convenience, directly relating to better performance. And the power of convenience has also resulted in customers feeling I can do this anytime I want. So my preparation is uniquely me. We call the customer segment as the individual now, not a segment. Every customer feels I'm uniquely enabled to take the test on my terms. And for the provider, they feel we're able to deliver this at scale globally without the parameters of geography concern. They have been able to scale on a global level. Scott?
I think it's an accurate reflection in terms of the spectrum. We have the higher ed folks in the midterm exam. I think that's a good, I wouldn't call it the low point, but it's lower on the spectrum, all the way up to the high stakes exam. And those have been the more recent aggressive adoption um, categories of both test takers as well as the test providers. And it all comes down to that convenience. It all comes down to, for the test taker, I've been to many physical sites for my certifications, and it's a half a day or longer type of a commitment to go and to the physical environment. And I need to schedule it usually in traditional office hours, so 8 a.m. to 5 p.m. This ability to take these types of exams on the higher end, the high stakes exams, from wherever I am, so I don't have to travel. I'm fortunate I live close to some of these test centers, but I know many folks are not. They may not even live here in the States, but want to be taking the same type of an exam. The, the way that online proctoring has facilitated that convenience for the end user, I think, is significant. And folks like myself who've been through both, it is a significant upside not to have to make the commitment and to be able to do those exams from literally anywhere.
You know, this is a very important perspective that made me think of the fact that what you're really doing is opening up opportunities for access where previously those opportunities may not have been available. So
Absolutely.
it's fascinating to these challenges are making us think in new ways. So thank you for that. That was very helpful. Scott, you and Shailu described in the overview the fact that users have to identify themselves, you know, and there's various ways to do that. So what are the ways that a user can identify themselves, and how that, you know, identity is confirmed perhaps, and what other concepts might you be thinking about? You know, tech is providing all sorts of different ways, biometric and who knows what, to provide identity. What's happening? What are you doing now, I guess I'll say, and what do you see coming down the road when it comes to identity?
Sure. So let me take you through the experience that a test taker has today, which in a phrase, a single phrase, is all about multi-factor authentication. meaning we as the proctors go through multiple different ways of authenticating that this individual is in fact who they say they are. So the test taker starts off by registering an account. When they register the account, they will log into the Examity platform, single sign-on from the school or the corporation or the organization traditionally, but they're brought to the Examity platform and they create a profile. And in the profile, they add a few of these factors. One of the things they might do is they might present a physical ID, take a picture of that, and that's recorded with their profile. So it's got some of the traditional attributes. We don't specify what the ID is. It's usually our client that specifies the type of ID, but the ID has to have some type of a photographic representation of the test taker. Some of the other things we're going to capture are the basics: first name, last name, email ID. Those are more just to identify them for an account point of view. But we'll then prompt them to add a few more factors into their profile. One of them is the traditional set of security questions. So we'll let them choose 2 or 3 security questions and then provide a unique answer, so that later when the test taker returns to take an exam, they'll be prompted for 1 or more of those questions and they have to produce their unique answer. Another one of the factors that we capture is what we call keyboard biometrics. It's really the keyboard, the typing sequence, the keystroke sequence. We ask them to type in first name, last name, and then first and last, just as a typing pattern. But what we're doing is we're capturing the cadence of the typing, which winds up being another, not completely unique, but is certainly a contributing factor in terms of representing that that human is who they say they are. So we're capturing these, call them credentials, right, during registration. And when the student comes back to take the actual exam, the proctor will greet them and say, "Hello, Shay Lu, I'll be your proctor today." And they ask a few of these questions. They'll ask potentially for that same ID. They'll ask for potentially the student to enter in one of their security questions. They'll be asked to type in their name sequence again so that that can be matched. So these are the factors that we're presenting to wind up with strong confidence that the student is in fact who they say they are. They're supposed to be the candidate taking the exam.
Interesting.
Now, you asked about future ways that we're examining. I'll pass it over to the Chief Innovation Officer here, Shay Lu, and he can talk about some of the things that are on the roadmap that we've been experimenting with.
What do you have there, Shay Lu?
So I think if you look at what Scott verified is the breadth of our offerings, which is modality of something you have, something you know, something that's inherent part of you like a biometric. Now we're adding depth to each of these. You will hear again that you may have heard in every conference used is the AI-based technologies, machine learning, and other technologies that are helping us strengthen the efficacy of these solutions. When we capture this data, how securely are we managing the data is an important aspect for us because that's front and center for everyone. Is my data safe? Second, is it simple to use? When you take a test taker's experience, the friction that you eliminate in the process is the ability for them to perform better. So we're making this process simpler for them, further simplified. How fast do they finish this process? No different than how you show a boarding pass and get onto a flight. We're trying to make it simplified to the extent that it feels like a non-event for them. At the same time, on the test provider, giving them this data that's important enough for them to know the right test taker has been identified in a very efficient way. So on the facial, audio, biometrics, PIN numbers, there's multi-dimensions of even mobile devices that are now making a play into the area of verification of identity. The quality of these devices of webcam resolution, audio is significantly high quality. We are using some of those emerging technologies and considering the application of blockchain and others in the coming few roadmap items because they are very powerful tools to improve user experience as a cornerstone of identity delivery.
Thank you very much. I want to turn the attention to a subject that is probably on everyone's mind right now, and that's the subject of privacy. You know, IMS and our members are very committed, as you know, to student data privacy, and we publish a privacy standard. For our viewers who may not have seen the standard, the entire program and the evaluation criteria can be found at trustedapps.org, trustedapps.org. It's very difficult, if not impossible, for most users now, or at least many users now, to isolate while they're online. How has this impacted your customer strategy?
I'll begin with kind of mentioning what's going on in the user's mind, but let you go into the depth of that topic on how you see the security aspect of it, because that plays into your strength area and specialty. I think as we call identity, we call it portable identity as a concept, where if I provided my data one time, trust is an inherent factor that who I am giving it to is managing it in a way that is responsible, non-shareable, and used only for the purposes of what I allowed them to do. So it's, I think, the two gamuts of my trust in the solution. Trusted app is a great parameter, Mark, you mentioned. Examity is on the realm of completing that certification from the IMS to say, when you, the test taker, are giving me your info, you can trust. And second, we are not using it for any other purpose, and keep the confidentiality and trust in full control within our realms. But Scott, in terms of how we are doing it, by all means, please pick it up.
Mark, privacy is one of the reasons why I came to Examity over a year ago. Shailu was looking for someone to come in and help to fortify that, to help to address things like the IMS standards, GDPR, the expansion internationally, not just here in the States, but internationally, the expansion of privacy legislation and the intense focus on it. And that is a primary part of my background. So in terms of what we're doing, we want to, as I said earlier, we want to be very non-intrusive to the user, but we do ask the user, not just for the authentication, we ask them to help us to authenticate the environment that they're in, which means during an exam, we ask them to isolate. So they're online. We don't take them offline, but we will ask them to shut down other applications. We'll ask them to shut down other browsers, no phones in the room, right? We want them to focus, not just to be able to provide the best performance, but also so that we understand there is integrity of the environment. Now, having done that, we're capturing a lot of privacy information that would certainly, from a legislation point of view, be considered privacy. All of the factors that Shailu has mentioned, something you are, something you have, something that you know, all that information is very private to an individual. We're also capturing, say, a picture of their environment, the picture that we're sharing here. That could also be considered privacy under some legislation. The point is, we are now the stewards of this information. We've taken on the role of providing the authentication for that user and providing the integrity of the exam, but in doing so, we've become the steward of a lot of potentially privacy-based information. Certainly, there's a lot that's in, the black and white space, but there's some that is in the gray space, and we continue to see legislation try and better define that boundary. Well, we treat it all as privacy information. So we apply controls, everything from encrypting the data to the data retention periods, not just required by law, but by practice. Data minimization, we don't collect anything that we don't need to collect from that user in order to perform the authentication and provide integrity to the experience. We also don't share it with anyone. It's not shared with anyone other than the proctors themselves and the proctors auditing the proctors, 2 stages. It's entirely on the platform. The only place that it ever goes is to a potential client. If a client wanted the exam results, beyond just the statistical results, if they wanted to see the video, they would be the only one that's ever entitled to access any of that information. And of course, it's all purged appropriately at the end of the relevant retention period. All of this is privacy information. There, you could debate whether or not this is as significant as someone's, say, bank account, right? That there's a lot more potential risk to that, but we don't debate that. We treat all of it at the same high level of privacy and build up security in terms of what do we do from an administrative point of view? What are our processes, not just with the candidate, but with our own staff and employees? What are the physical controls we put in place, not just with the candidate scanning their environment and physical IDs, but what do we do in terms of putting the proctor in a physical environment where we're monitoring them? We're auditing the proctors themselves. And finally, all the technical controls that you would see, everything from how do you, reliably handle an identity? How do you provision that identity? How do you handle the authentication through all those multiple factors online. How do we handle authorization, not just for the end user, but for anyone with administrative access to our data on our platform? There's an entire spectrum of these controls that need to be fortified and continuously reviewed. So we're not sitting still saying, okay, we're done. We've implemented 75 different controls. That's complete. We don't need to pay attention anymore. We're constantly assessing our own work in terms of where are we, what is the risk that's introduced to any of the stakeholders, and what's the state of play in the market. Can we investigate, to Shea Liu's point, and a big part of his job, can we investigate additional controls? What is the balance in terms of how does that fortify the risk mitigation while not interfering with the candidate's experience, while not making it so obtrusive that the candidate just wants to say, no, that's too intrusive, I'm done. I don't want that much security. It's a continuous balance, and it is an ongoing evolution. And I think we'll see a lot more of that as privacy legislation matures across international countries to come up to the same level that GDPR is set for us.
Yeah, you mentioned GDPR. So what assurances, if any, do you provide your customers in the market that their privacy will be protected? You explained it in great detail. Are there specific, besides, let's say, GDPR, regulatory standards that you're adopting? And again, with the emphasis on assurances to your customer.
Absolutely. So just please remember this one phrase from this afternoon: trust through transparency. Right? The best thing any of us can do as providers and stewards of private information on behalf of consumers is to provide transparency. That doesn't mean open everything up and, go and look at the log files, but it does mean things like third-party attestations, certifications, assessments, and audits. It also means using some standard benchmarks. So we began years ago by basically demonstrating that we comply with international law, starting here in the United States with things like FERPA for higher ed, right? And moving beyond that, even into Canada as well, and now internationally with GDPR. But there are also a range of standards that have significantly matured, and the adoption, I'm quite pleased to say, the adoption has been skyrocketing in the last few years. One of them is US-based NIST, or the Cybersecurity Framework. That's a simplified way of deploying hundreds of controls in the NIST standard 800-53 and 800-171. Mm-hmm. The point is, that's a benchmark, but it's very US-centric in terms of it coming from NIST. So ISO has come forward, and they have taken that as well as other national standards, and they've developed the entire body of ISO 27000. 27001 begins with the information security controls. There's 114 of them, I believe. We use that as our benchmark, both the internal assessments as well as now heading in Q1 for an external certification against that, so that we can publish the certification, again, to demonstrate transparency to our consumers, to our clients and the end users, that we are adhering to this international standard. But we're reaching beyond that as well. We're looking at standards like ISO 27005, which is more about risk management. Many of the end users don't even understand what that is, so may not care as much about that certification. But 27017 and 27018 have to do with security and privacy, data privacy, for cloud providers like Examity. All of these standards are benchmarks where we strive to be certified against these benchmarks and to demonstrate to our community we're investing in these controls. And it's not just a self-attestation, we're getting independent industry players to certify.
It sounds like you are giving the appropriate level of attention to these really important subjects. So that's a terrific answer. I appreciate that a lot. I'm going to change directions a little bit. I'm a firm believer in the fact that a tool is only as good as its customers' best usage. And I always look for exemplar customers, as I refer to them. Most products have some customers that stand out as the best at using their products as designed, or even in ways that the designers did not anticipate. Organizations that really press your product to the limit and allow your product to grow and morph into other maybe even better ways. So how do your exemplar customers approach test security and integrity?
We are industry focused and customer obsessed. We have these learnings that are very, very precious, Mark. And then what we have seen in the industry and the customers who are working with us in tandem, and we had the opportunity and luxury to work with IMS to bring two key themes. One was interoperability and one was standardization. The two key themes that are very, very essential for us, and we are pleased to be working with IMS on implementing the LTI 1.3 standards that brought interoperability and a foundational framework, number one, because Examity is a part of the wheel and it's a cog, not the end of the whole process. Interoperability made it entrench into the process organically. Second is standardization. So proctoring can come in variety of exams, variety of security models. Standardization helps bring all of this in the IMS LTI proctoring standards, which is regardless of which assessment platform you have on one hand, which proctoring provider you have on one hand, we have the common framework now that proctoring will be defined almost like a USB-C standard. So anyone can plug in any platform, both on where the exam resides, the proctoring is provided, but the definition is consistent. This helps the customers greatly because they're speaking the same language, regardless of change of tools and providers and platforms.
Yep.
Our exemplar customers have helped us significantly across, if we call these fundamentals, the verticals are user identity, proctoring, content protection, and analytics that give us the delivery summary of this. I think that's what we have seen. Certainly the deployment of LTI has helped adoption. Embedding into the user environment made the user experience better, and the embedded security that came as standard. We spoke about security at length, thanks to Scott, but it became a backend process that the customers feel comfortable, something is being taken care of. So it was very complex for us to make it simple, but give to the customers, and they have helped us innovate. We're constantly seeking feedback. What are you looking for? But we're not forgetting that we have to also bring industry standards. We have to work with IMS and say, what are you seeing in the adoption on higher ed, K-12, corporate? It's an amalgamation of all of these best practices. So it's never about what do you need. It is more about what is best for the industry and the customer in how we execute these solutions.
Yeah, standardization is an under-recognized value of a contributor to security. To your point, both of you pointed that out, and I couldn't agree more. And very much along this line of transparency that you mentioned, you know, the concept of standardization, interoperability, and transparency all go hand in glove in contributing to a more secure environment, in addition to the many other benefits of the plug and play foundation that LTI provides. I did want to have one additional question, unless you all would like to suggest some additional ones. And that has to do with creative uses that your customers have brought to you. Can you share some examples of creative uses of your product or that your customers have brought to you to help you drive your roadmap?
One thing that I'll take a specific example, because those are actually the proof of what customers have done that even we did not anticipate, was called exam proctoring templates. So we gave them a framework of standard rules of proctoring. You can add additional rules and you can add some special instructions. Mathematics department in one of our customers came up with an idea. We could convert this into a rule template. We can distribute into other departments, similar type of delivery of exams, and it became viral where a lot of them use the template. They don't have to key in the same rules. Once you set it up, you can apply that template to multiple exams. I think the beauty about working with those scenarios as an example of exam template is that a community is formed when customers like something and they are very, very deep in math and science. They are able to think of ways we cannot think in their absence and suggest it back. So we have a customer advisory group that we bring back, and they said, did you realize that you could make it a product function? So some of the best features of Examity have been a result of direct customer innovation and not just Examity's own labs. So exam templates would be the one. and it consistently gets used. The best way I can measure a product success is in its usage, and the exam templates get used thousands of times every day, which is proof of one professor's idea has gone to thousands of professors, but the credit goes to the chief innovation officer, and I'm not complaining. I just play
Right,
chief
sure.
listening officer.
Yeah,
But we
good
owe it to the
idea,
customers.
Shailu. Yeah,
That's the thing.
Shailu, and I'm sorry to interrupt. Shailu and
please.
Scott, you've made this a terrific session. So I want to thank you both for really providing very informative program on test integrity and proctoring in the Learning Impact On Demand series for 2020. So thank you both.
We appreciate the time, and we appreciate the questions, Mark. It was a pleasure.
Thank you, Mark.
Thank you.